Most Beatles fans can name every track on Rubber Soul without hesitation, but almost no one stops to ask why one of those songs feels strangely out of place. Not bad, not poorly written, just different. Like it's hiding a story the rest of the album doesn't reveal. And that's because one track on this legendary record wasn't part of the original vision at all. It wasn't crafted during the inspired, late 1965 burst that shaped the band's new identity. It wasn't born from the creative transformation that made Rubber Soul the turning point in their career. In fact, it wasn't even from that year. This song had been quietly discarded, left behind, and forgotten until Paul pulled it back from the shadows when the band hit a problem nobody saw coming. As Rubber Soul neared its deadline, the pressure was crushing. The Beatles were expected to deliver an album that lived up to the hype of their evolving sound, and they had to do it fast. Recording sessions were crammed between TV appearances, interviews, and the demands of global fame. The clock was ticking, and George Martin wanted a finished album ready for the Christmas season. But as sessions dragged on, one harsh reality became impossible to ignore. They were about to miss the deadline. They simply didn't have enough songs. And missing a release window in the mid-1960 seconds Beatles universe, that wasn't an option. So Paul made a move almost no one knows about today. He reached back farther back than fans would ever guess and pulled out a track from a previous era. A leftover. A song they had already rejected. A track that wasn't written for Rubber Soul, didn't match its tone, and wasn't part of its creative DNA. Yet, in one moment of pressure, it became the secret puzzle piece that completed one of music's most celebrated albums. And that's where the real story begins, because this isn't just about a forgotten song. It's about deadlines, improvisation, and the unpredictable decisions that shape masterpieces. It's about how one abandoned track survived by pure necessity and ended up on an album people still call perfect. And once you understand where this song came from, you'll never hear Rubber Soul the same way again. But before revealing how this forgotten track resurfaced, you have to understand the environment the Beatles were trapped in: the chaos, the expectations, and the fear of disappointing millions. That part of the story exposes a side of the band people rarely think about. And that pressure is what set the stage for one of the strangest decisions in Beatles history. From the outside, Rubber Soul feels effortless. Warm harmonies, clever songwriting, surprising instruments, and a maturity that seemed to appear overnight. But behind the studio doors, it was anything but calm. The Beatles were exhausted. They were touring relentlessly, doing interviews non-stop, and recording in tiny pockets of time squeezed between constant travel. They were evolving faster than the world could keep up, but their schedule never slowed down. And Rubber Soul wasn't some leisurely, well-planned creative project. It was a frantic race with almost no margin for error. EMI wanted the album out before Christmas. That meant every track, every edit, every mix needed to be done in just a few weeks. And because the Beatles' audience was expanding rapidly, expectations were sky high. Fans wanted something deeper. Critics sensed the band was at a turning point. And the Beatles themselves felt they had to push into new artistic territory or risk falling into repetition. They were tired of being seen as the yeah band. They were ready for something bigger, and Rubber Soul was the album that had to prove they were more than catchy singles and mop-top charm. But time was their enemy. Deadlines didn't care about creativity. Songs weren't appearing quickly enough, and the band couldn't simply conjure a dozen masterpieces on command. For all the public talk about their chemistry and magic, real songwriting still takes time they didn't have. And the more the clock ticked down, the more desperate the situation became. Meanwhile, they were experimenting harder than ever. George was bringing in sitar. Paul was exploring unconventional bass tones. John was diving into introspective lyrics. And each experiment slowed them down. What made Rubber Soul special was also what made it harder to make. They were reinventing themselves. But reinvention isn't fast. As sessions dragged on, a realization hit them like a brick. They were one song short. Not one idea short. One finished, mixed, ready to publish track short. That was a disaster. Missing the deadline would mean missing the biggest sales season of the year, and it would disrupt the momentum that was carrying them into their most creative era. They had to solve the problem immediately. No time for writing something new. No time to polish something rough. They needed a finished song they could plug in and finalize quickly. That's when Paul remembered something the rest of the world had forgotten: a track recorded months earlier during the making of Help. A track they liked enough to record but not enough to release. A song that had faded into the background until the band suddenly needed it. And that's how the forgotten song began its journey back into the spotlight. Months earlier, before the Rubber Soul sessions began, the Beatles were working on the film soundtrack project Help. That album included massive hits and iconic tracks tied to the movie, but not every song made the final cut. Hidden deep within those sessions was a tune written mainly by Paul, with contributions from John. It had the emotional tension of early Beatles music, mixed with a slightly darker edge. It was recorded, reviewed, and ultimately left behind. That song was Wait. It wasn't rejected because it was bad. Far from it. The Beatles recorded tons of material during the Help era, and not everything fit the tone of the film or the album. Wait was one of those in-between songs, too strong to throw away, but not perfect for the project at hand. So they shelved it, and in the mid-1960 seconds, Beatles world, shelving a song usually meant one thing: it would never see the light of day. But here's the twist. Wait was already mostly done. Instrumental track laid down, vocals recorded, structure complete, even harmonies were present. And for months, it sat untouched, forgotten in the archives. Had Rubber Soul gone differently, Wait would have stayed buried. Fans today wouldn't even know its name. This is what makes its resurrection so fascinating. Most albums grow naturally from fresh ideas, but Wait was like a ghost from another era, a leftover resurrected during a crisis. When the Beatles were scrambling for one final track to finish Rubber Soul, this earlier recording suddenly became their lifeline. Paul didn't pitch it as a masterpiece or a perfect fit. He pitched it because it existed, because it was already recorded, because, in a moment when they needed something instantly workable, Wait was the only realistic option. It wasn't a bold, creative decision. It was survival. Of course, the Beatles weren't going to slap an untouched, months-old track onto an album as ambitious as Rubber Soul. So they updated it, added new overdubs, layered harmonies, slightly altered instrumentation. They didn't rewrite its DNA, but they polished it just enough to seem like it belonged among the new songs. And that's where the deeper mystery begins, because while Wait was rescued at the last minute, it ended up revealing more about the band's creative process than almost any other track on the album. And understanding why it survived tells us something important about the Beatles themselves. The Beatles recorded many songs that never made it onto albums. Some were half-finished sketches. Others were experiments. A few were strong, but didn't match the tone of the project. So why did this leftover survive? Why was Wait the one Paul pulled out instead of any other abandoned track? The answer lies in timing, practicality, and the way the band worked under pressure. First, Wait was polished enough to be revived quickly. The core performance was solid. The vocals were clean. The instrumental track needed minimal fixing. And, crucially, it didn't require rewriting. That made it the perfect emergency candidate. When you're racing against a deadline, you don't grab a broken car. You grab one that still runs. Second, the emotional tone of Wait wasn't out of place for Rubber Soul. It wasn't a perfect match, but it wasn't wildly incompatible either. The album blended introspection, longing, and evolving maturity. Wait, with its themes of uncertainty and emotional tension, fit the mood more than people think. It wasn't a stretch to include it. It simply wasn't made with the same artistic intention as the rest of the album. Third, Paul's instincts played a major role. He had a memory for melodies. He didn't forget songs easily. And when pressure mounted, he knew what options they still had. Paul was the type of writer who always had something tucked away, a fragment, a chord sequence, a nearly finished piece. Wait was one of those kept in the back pocket ideas, and because he remembered it, it had a second life. Fourth, the band trusted their own craftsmanship. Even when dealing with older material, they believed their instincts were good enough to elevate anything they touched. They weren't afraid of taking risks or pulling from the past. They were confident that with the right tweaks, Wait could stand alongside the brand new masterpieces John and Paul were writing. Finally, the practical reality. They were out of time. Other songs might have had more potential, but potential wasn't what they needed. They needed something ready. And Wait was ready. This decision wasn't glamorous. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't even artistic in the usual sense. It was pure necessity. But sometimes necessity creates fascinating outcomes, because when you listen to Wait today, it feels like a window into the Beatles' past that accidentally slipped into their future. And that accident tells us something important about the contradictions baked into Rubber Soul. People speak about Rubber Soul as if it emerged fully formed from creative genius. But the truth is more complicated. The album's brilliance came with compromises, rushed moments, and last-minute saves. And Wait is the clearest reminder of that reality. Instead of breaking the illusion, it deepens it. For one, it shows that the Beatles weren't perfectionists in the modern sense. They didn't endlessly revise, re-record, or delay releases. They worked fast. Sometimes incredibly fast. Their pressure cooker environment forced them to make decisions instinctively, trusting their talent more than their planning. That urgency gave their music a raw, organic energy you can't fake. It also reveals how albums can have hidden layers of improvisation. Listeners often imagine great records as carefully crafted from top to bottom. In reality, some of the best music comes from spontaneous decisions, pulling a forgotten track from the vault, adding a few harmonies, and trusting that the whole will be stronger than the parts. Wait also exposes how close the Beatles sometimes came to missing deadlines. Despite their legendary status, they struggled with schedule, fatigue, and expectations like any working musicians, just at a much larger scale. This wasn't a band lounging in a creative paradise. This was a band sprinting through chaos, trying to stay ahead of demand. And finally, Wait shows the fascinating clash between intention and outcome. The band didn't plan for this song to help define Rubber Soul. They didn't design it to join the album's narrative. Yet decades later, it's part of the mythology, a reminder that even masterpieces rely on unexpected moments. With all this context, the track becomes more than a leftover. It becomes a symbol of survival, resourcefulness, and the messy reality behind great art. But it also raises a bigger question. How does Wait fit alongside the album's legendary tracks? Rubber Soul is full of songs that feel groundbreaking and modern even today. Norwegian Wood, In My Life, Girl, Michelle. These tracks mark a shift toward deeper themes, more complex arrangements, and emotional nuance. And then there's Wait, the rescued artifact from another era. Its differences aren't flaws, they're clues. Unlike the introspective, philosophical tone of the newer Rubber Soul material, Wait still carries the DNA of the Help era. The urgency in the vocals, the more direct emotional expression, the simpler arrangement. It's a bridge between two versions of the Beatles, the young pop icons and the emerging songwriters who would soon make Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. This contrast has fascinated critics for years. Some argue that Wait disrupts the album's flow. Others say it adds texture. But almost no one realizes how accidental that contrast was. The Beatles didn't place it there as an artistic statement. It became one by circumstance. Yet the contrast works. It highlights how quickly the band evolved. It reminds listeners that just a few months separate early Beatles from mid-period Beatles, an evolution so rapid it's nearly unbelievable. And the presence of Wait makes that transformation even more dramatic. It shows where they had been and where they were going, all in the same track list. But beyond the artistic argument, Wait adds something more emotional: vulnerability. It's one of the few moments on Rubber Soul where you can still hear traces of the band's earlier uncertainty, like a faint echo from a previous life. And in its own way, that makes the album stronger. Which brings us to the deeper meaning behind this forgotten track. On the surface, pulling a leftover into an album might seem like a minor detail. But this story reveals something essential about the Beatles' journey. It shows that even the greatest artists face limitations: time, fatigue, doubt. And yet, those limitations don't stop greatness. They shape it. Wait isn't just a song. It's a reminder that art isn't always clean or controlled. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it's rushed. Sometimes it's salvaged from old ideas. And sometimes those imperfections become part of its charm. It also highlights the importance of instinct in the Beatles' process. They didn't overthink the decision. They didn't analyze it endlessly. They felt something, trusted it, and acted. That instinctual approach is part of what made their music so alive. And there's something strangely poetic about the fact that Wait survived purely because the band needed one more track. It didn't rise through genius. It rose through necessity. Yet even that necessity became part of a masterpiece that changed music history. This forgotten song reminds us that great albums aren't perfect constructions. They're living documents of the moment they were created, moments full of stress, inspiration, improvisation, and uncertainty. And that brings us to the final takeaway. Rubber Soul is often described as the Beatles' first true masterpiece, a turning point that paved the way for everything that followed. But knowing the story of Wait gives the album a new dimension. It becomes more human, more relatable, more real. You hear it differently when you know that one of its songs wasn't crafted in the same creative burst as the others. You realize how thin the line was between perfection and chaos. You understand how much pressure the band faced, and how their quick decisions shaped history. Wait may not be the album's best track, it may not be its deepest, but it's the most revealing. It shows the cracks beneath the surface, the forgotten ideas, the rushed moments, the hidden choices. And those cracks don't weaken the album, they make it stronger. Because a masterpiece isn't just the result of brilliance, it's the result of persistence, instinct, and sometimes scrambling to meet a deadline. Wait is the quiet reminder that even legends have to improvise. And once you know that story, you'll never listen to Rubber Soul the same way again. Because now, behind every harmony and every lyric, you can hear the truth. Even masterpieces have secrets.